Okay, thank you. Okay, Case, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today on rapid onset gender dysphoria, faulty science and social contagion. There are four competing but not mutually exclusive conceptual models regarding gender dysphoria. The first is that it's a physical illness that must be treated medically and or surgically. The second is that it's a sexual minority with rights of recognition. The third, that it constitutes a developmental psychopathology. And the fourth is that it's a psychic epidemic caused by social contagion. What is social contagion? Simply, it's a harmful idea or practice spread by close contacts in social networks. Social contagion is a social construction that predates the internet. It predated the advent of the cyber age, therefore placing the origins in the minds of humankind, relegating social media to its role as an efficient conduit of social contagion. In 1774, Goethe wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther, which launched a suicide cluster of young people who had been disappointed in love. In 1984, a suicide of a young Austrian businessman who threw himself in front of a train initiated a spate of similar suicides. When Goethe's book was removed from the public and media exposure of the train suicide was stopped, the suicide rate dropped by 80% almost immediately in both cases. More recently, we've noted the Werther effect in celebrity suicides from a very large study coming out of South Korea, published just late last year. In this study, the authors tracked the suicide rate across the population 10 days before a celebrity suicide, and then they tracked the suicide rate 10 days after the suicide. And you can see from the dark blue line that there was a very sharp increase in suicides immediately following the celebrity suicide. When we divide the population by age groups, and you can see the four age groups there, you will notice that the ages of 10 to 29 had the sharpest increases in suicide following the celebrity suicide rate. And there was a very small but almost no change in the suicide rate for older people. Similarly, if we partition the population by male and female, you will again see that females were much more likely to engage in copycat suicides immediately after the celebrity suicide compared with males. This is exactly the same pattern of social contagion that we are witnessing in gender dysphoria. That is, young females aged 10 to 29 are most susceptible to the message of gender ideology. We have to ask ourselves, is this a coincidence? So change in reporting and social media exposure following the celebrity suicides resulted in a significant decrease in copycat suicides, just as it had done in 1774 and 1984. So who is most affected apart from young women aged 10 to 29? Well, within this subgroup, the most vulnerable adolescent females are most affected. Many have multiple mental health diagnoses, including autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, ADD, social anxiety disorder, depression, including major depressive disorder, identity confusion, family issues, confusion regarding their sexual orientation, including internalized homophobia, and fear that they will never be attractive to men. Social contagion begins with the distortion of reality. It is followed by a cult-like adherence to the faulty precepts that tolerates no rational challenges to their veracity. A few years ago, there was a very compelling series called 13 Reasons Why, in which there were 13 episodes outlining the suicide of a young adolescent female from a range of different perspectives. The National Association of School Psychologists published a statement that included the following: "We do not recommend that vulnerable youth, especially those who have any degree of suicidal ideation, watch this series. Its powerful storytelling may lead impressionable viewers to romanticize the choices made by the characters and/or to develop revenge fantasies." This statement could well apply to those who've been seduced by gender ideology. Similarly, the epidemic of anorexia nervosa follows a similar pattern. Mostly young adolescent and young adult females are affected, in which the thin represents the body ideal. Anorexia is not just about striving for an idealised body image. It's an obsessive, relentless and futile quest to be pure, perfect and clean. So what are some of the conceptual distortions in transgender ideology? The first is that gender identity is fixed and immutable during childhood. The second is that sex is somehow assigned at birth. That is, that the 9 months of gestation and the genetic material contained in ova and sperm have nothing to do with the sex that appears before people when a child is born. Another distortion is that gender is a personal choice and that you can change your natal sex to match your perceived gender through hormones and surgery. Regret and detransition mean that gender identity is not fixed and immutable during childhood and therefore have to be denied. And there's no doubt about it. If you look at the postings of the gender lobby, gender ideology lobby on the internet, they vehemently deny that regret is anything more than less than a fraction of 1%, and there are hardly any detransitioners. Well, we know for certain that that's absolutely untrue. Gender reassignment surgeons are reporting increases in requests for reversal surgeries. We're seeing young females who went onto the GoFundMe site to fund their mastectomies now going back on the sites to fund their breast reconstructions. I do recommend everybody watch the BBC documentary One Life, Make Me a Man Again, which was published as long ago as 2004. Also have a look at the website Sex Change Regret, run by Walt Heyer, that has 25,000 visits a month. There's also the Detransition Advocacy Network, where hormones and surgery may alter appearances, but nothing changes the immutable fact of your sex. Longer-term regret in adulthood has not been systematically studied, and studies are urgently needed. There is no regret or detransition, really. There are now tens of thousands of young people suffering from their decision to detransition, to transition. The concept of social contagion is anathema to each of these distortions in transgender ideology. Another documentary that I would strongly recommend is this wonderful account of a young detransitioner, which unfortunately I don't have time to show you today, but I've provided the link for those interested later. Oh, sorry. So, where's the evidence for gender ideology? The evidence regarding psychosocial and cognitive impacts are generally lacking. It's a momentous step in the dark to prescribe cross-sex hormones and mutilating surgery to young people whose bodies are not fully developed. It's an unregulated live experiment on children. giving children the right to independently make life-changing decisions at an age when they cannot be expected to understand the consequences of those decisions, lacks scientific evidence and is contrary to established medical practice. Project Nettie, which I recommend to those interested in doing their own study on the problems with gender ideology, state, it is wholly ideological, scientifically inaccurate and socially irresponsible to recast biological sex as a social construct, which then becomes a matter of chosen individual identity. So one of the biggest denials in transgender ideology is the denial of the phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria. Prevalence estimates of gender dysphoria before the onset of ROGD indicated male to female cases outnumbered female to male cases, with 1 per 10,000 males and 1 per 27,000 females. These rates qualify for orphan designation status, defined by the European Union as less than 5 in 10,000 of the general population. Now we're seeing an incredibly rapid increase in young people declaring them transgender, and we're seeing a reversal of the ratios between boys and girls. This graph shows the annual referrals starting from 2009-10 to 2016-17. And you can see that as of about 2014, the extremely rapid increase in girls declaring themselves transgender compared with boys. In the UK, in the Gender Identity Disorder Clinic, numbers rose from 200 to 2,000, a tenfold increase in 5 years. And they too observed a very strong reversal of male-female ratios. The DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, estimated that natal adult males who are transgender constitute about 0.005% of the population, and natal adult females 0.002% of the adult population. If we have a look at the adolescent transgender estimates of 0.7% of 13 to 17-year-olds living in the USA identifying as transgender, this estimate is between 140 for males and 350 for females, times higher than that for adult males and females. These figures cannot be explained by anything other than social contagion phenomenon. I've compiled figures in Australia that support international figures that I've just quoted. And I've mainly focused on America and the UK, but the same figures have been identified in Scandinavia, Finland, Sweden, and in other countries in Europe. You can see from the same time frame, 2014 to 2019, the extremely rapid rise in young people presenting to gender clinics throughout Australia, in the states that had gender clinics up to 2019, which were New South Wales, Western Australia, Queensland and Victoria. The percentage of children seeking treatment for gender dysphoria and the proportion of children from the general population aged 15 to 19 in these 4 states show that there's a disproportion between the states. So New South Wales is underrepresented in the number of children seeking treatment. Western Australia and Victoria are grossly overrepresented, and these are hubs of social contagion. We all know about the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, which is a super spreader of gender dysphoria and transition among young people. And you can see the disproportionate representation in Victoria of young people seeking treatment at gender clinics. So again, strong evidence of social contagion and social networks and hubs within those social networks that are supporting the spread of these harmful ideas. So Western Australia accounts for 14% of children aged 5 to 19 in the Australian population, but accounts for 23% of young people enrolled in gender disorder clinics. Victoria accounts for 32% of children aged 5 to 19 in the Australian population, but accounts for 41% of young people enrolled in gender clinics. This is evidence of clustering, a major phenomenon seen in other social contagions throughout history. So if we look at gender development in adolescence, we find longitudinally that most gender non-conforming children will later identify as a sexual minority. The majority of them, if they're allowed to develop normally along their normal trajectory, 80% of cross-gender behaving boys eventually become gay men and are able to accept their sexual orientation. The other possibilities are that they become genderqueer youth, some become heterosexual youth, and an extremely small minority will remain transgender. So social contagion does not just affect young adolescent females. If we have a look at what's happening in society, we see that people and organisations and institutions that are supposed to protect young people from harmful ideas and practices are in fact suborning those practices. These are the government-appointed gatekeepers of child safety who ought to be questioning and scrutinising the affirmation-only approach to transition for children. Instead, they are endorsing it. And shame on the Australian Human Rights Commission, the E-Safety Commission, the State Commissioners for Children and Young People, people like Michelle Telfer receiving hagiographic interviews and Australian stories and so on, the Family Court of Australia, the ABC, all of these places who are supposed to protect children are in fact doing the opposite. So parents beware and the community beware. Use your own judgment and knowledge of your child before deciding on the gender transition pathway. If in doubt, wait, watch and wonder and consider the toxic role of social contagion in your child's current struggles with their gender identity. Thank you.